Hello. We have 3 stories today, 2 from ProRevenge and 1 of Petty Revenge at the end because it's always fun to end on something lighthearted. Our first story will have you salivating over the trifecta of revenge deliciousness. Contractors, lawyers, and banks get put up on the chopping block in Story 1. An attorney's dream case. My parents versus the bank. In 1973, my parents had enough money to build a little ranch house in the country. A small bank in town approved the mortgage and the bank signed a contract to give Bob the money to build the house. Bob, as it turns out, was overbooking himself all over town, leaving his clueless minions to do the actual work. The build took longer and longer, with more and more work having to be ripped out and redone. We're not talking about using the wrong color paint or nailing up some wonky trim here. The architect forgot to fully erase a line on the blueprints, and the framers built a wall through the bathtub. My mother was told, "Don't put anything heavy in the kitchen cabinets," because they were attached to the drywall, not the studs, using a few roofing nails through the back of each cabinet. The garage door opening was framed into the living room instead of towards the driveway, and so on. When the bank's representative showed up for the final inspection, my parents met him in the front yard and refused to sign off on Bob's work. Then representative became angry as the bank had paid Bob a lot of money. He strode to the front door and pulled on the doorknob, whereupon the entire door, casing included, fell on him. It had simply been wedged, not nailed, into place. The bank called Bob, who finally showed up to supervise the work himself. The only problem was that Bob wasn't any better at building a house than his minions were. My parents still refused to sign off on the house. My mother was a stay-at-home mom in a nasty rental with 2 tiny children, while my dad was working 2 jobs while this was going on. Throughout the entire process, the bank and Bob treated them very poorly, bullying my mom and lying to my dad. What should have been an exciting time for my parents was ruined. My mom cried a lot, my dad got depressed. Finally, the bank threatened my parents with foreclosure, and Bob threatened to sue my parents for breach of contract because the bank refused to pay him any more money. So my exhausted parents went to an attorney and gave him the rundown. Plumbing, electrical, tilling issues, the whole sorry mess. My parents were scared. All they had was their small down payment savings, so if this became a lengthy court battle, the bank and Bob would win. The attorney, Tom, was kind, but my dad said he could tell that he and Mom were doomed from Tom's facial expressions as he sorted through the paperwork. Then, abruptly, Tom smiled. "Let's get everyone together for a meeting," he told my parents. "Tomorrow." So my parents, Tom, the bank's representative, the bank's attorney, Bob, and Bob's attorney met at the bank. Tom didn't give anyone else time to begin. He said, "Well, my clients have decided that they no longer want this house. Please remove it." Everyone else started to laugh. "Remove it? Have you lost your mind?" Tom, in a sweeping, theatrical gesture, placed a deed on the table. "My clients own the land the house is sitting on outright. They no longer want the house. Get the house off my client's land." Bob's attorney stared at the deed and then turned and stared at Bob. "You built a house on land you don't own?" Bob nodded. The bank's attorney started yelling at the bank's representative. "You didn't finance the land the house is on?" The representative stammered, No? Tom said firmly, "As I said, gentlemen, you're trespassing on my client's land. I expect the house to be removed and the land returned to its original state at once." My dad said he'll remember the blank looks everyone on the other side of the table passed to one another for his whole life. Sure, the bank could foreclose on a house that wouldn't exist by the end of the week with no way to recoup the money. They didn't even own the land it was on. Bob was out the 50% he paid out of pocket, plus he was on the hook for tearing down the house and removing it. On top of that, the bank would undoubtedly want him to repay the initial 50% they'd given him. Could they have gone after my parents? Sure. A foreclosure would have meant bad credit for my parents moving forward. They might lose their down payment. But to sign off on the house in its condition at that time would have meant thousands and thousands of dollars in cash to replace, repair everything, from the roof to the basement before the house could be safely lived in. The bank knew my parents didn't have that kind of money. They're the ones who approved the mortgage. Suddenly, my parents were good people. It was all such a misunderstanding, and the bank and Bob couldn't do enough for them. The house was brought in line with the original blueprints and specifications immediately at no extra cost to my parents, but at considerable cost to Bob. My parents signed the mortgage. Bob got the rest of his money and just about broke even on the build. The bank's representative was fired. And Tom, attorney extraordinaire, got a stinging tale of triumph to recall to fellow attorneys for the rest of his life. Before you question this tale, please remember that 1973 was 50 years ago. Banks did things differently back then. Smaller rural banks, in particular, were not run the same way the bigger city banks were. There were far fewer federal regulations, and in a smaller community, people didn't always follow them anyway. I'm pretty sure they don't always follow them now. Edit. Yes, they built a wall through the bathtub. No, I'm not making that up. I even left out how a plumber left his lunch bag on a partially built kitchen cabinet, but the cabinet maker didn't feel it was his job to move the bag. So he left it there and built the rest of the cabinet around it. I don't know where Bob found these people, but they were gems, every one of them. In the comments, Hazlitt asked, I understand that the bank and Bob lost, but I'm confused. The mortgage was to build a house, right? Why does building on land not owned or not financing the land come into play? OP replied, if you build on someone else's land and you either don't have permission or your permission is rescinded, you have to remove the structure from the land. Bob built on someone else's property and was too dim to get a contract giving him explicit permission to do so. He assumed his contract gave him rights he didn't have. GT Beamer said, I would have said, nope, remove the house, I'll have someone else build it. They could have gotten so much more. They could have gotten a steep discount or more rooms for sure. The gap between where the bank currently was and what the maximum inflictable damage was huge. OP replied, I agree. I think my parents were just worn out and tired from the whole mess and just wanted their house. But still, I agree with you. Legal loophole for the win. Isn't it delicious when things go in favor of the good people? Just warms my heart. I really hope this home is still in the family and they continue to tell the heroic tale of Tom the attorney and his triumph over Bob the builder and his janky build. Our second story features a man recently wronged by a neighbor who thinks he got away with it and turns around to give him the proverbial keys to his kingdom for an epic revenge opportunity. In story 2, a neighbor hit my car and lied about it, so I ruined 300 pounds of meat while he was on vacation. This happened about 5 or 6 years ago. For some context, my neighbor, we'll call him Chester, is your stereotypical weekend outdoorsman type. He owns at least 10 different baseball caps and they all have camo on them. He's one of those. He drives a Jeep, which will be important later, and usually spends his weekends either hunting, fishing, or prepping for when the bombs drop. I tried to explain to him once that we were within the fallout range of a major city, so if it got hit, we'd be screwed either way. But whatever. Everyone needs a hobby, and some people's is collecting canned peaches. 2 weeks before the revenge, I came outside to see my car had a broken window on the passenger side, and that part of the frame was dented just above the door handle. I can tell immediately from the size and shape of the dent exactly what it was from. As I said, my neighbor Chester drives a Jeep, and mounted on his front grille is a cable winch he uses for pulling stumps and whatnot. It juts out almost 1.5 feet in front of the bumper and is made of solid metal. Anyone with a picture of the winch and the shape of the dent in my car could CSI that just from eyeballing it. The dent is almost identically shaped and situated at the same height the winch was mounted. On top of that, Chester lives directly across the street from me and he likes to back into his driveway. Conveniently enough, my car is always parked on the street, so he has ample opportunities to hit it. I asked Chester about it, and without saying anything, he shook his head while biting his lip like some clueless cartoon character. I then asked if anyone who borrowed his car might have done it because the winch itself was pretty scratched up, almost like he's been ramming it into things all over town. Again, Chester silently shakes his head and then tries to tell me it was probably teenagers. No exposition, mind you, he just blamed it on teenagers. I was fuming, but kept my composure and went home to call the police and my insurance company to report it. I managed to get a competent police officer who told me point blank that it was clear what happened, but without a witness, it would be pointless to try and prove it. The insurance agent was equally certain of Chester's guilt, but ended up recommending I pay out of pocket for the repair. Since I was parking on the street, it was a factor the insurance company might use against me if I filed the claim. When it came time for them to recalculate and adjust my monthly rate, I could see a significant increase. A few hundred out of pocket right now could save me several hundred a year going forward if my rate was increased due to my own negligence. Which is what the claim would, unfortunately, be categorized as. Raw deal for sure, but at least he was honest with me. Fast forward to 2 weeks later, Chester and his family are going up north to rough it in nature for a week. And despite my cold attitude towards him in recent days, he asks me to keep an eye on his house while he's gone. Since I'm the only person in the neighborhood that he trusts, apparently. I agreed to it, not because I had any type of revenge in mind, but because he gifted me a large case of beer for my service. His one request was that I call him if we have any extreme weather because he'd need me to check on something. 2 nights after he left, we had a nasty storm. Wind, hail, and even a few rolling blackouts. The next morning, I called Chester to ask what he needed me to check on, but he didn't answer. Knowing Chester, he'd probably set up camp in some rural part of America with no dang cell phone service, even though he asked me to call him if this happened. After a few failed attempts, I went over to his house to inspect for any potential issues that might have arisen from the weather. I figured he was probably worried about his garage flooding since his yard was frequently a moat after heavy rain. I went into the garage and there was no flooding, but something caught my eye immediately. 4 large freezer chests lined up side by side, taking up a huge chunk of the wall. I peeked inside one and immediately realized what Chester was worried about. All 4 of them were packed from floor to lid with meat. Some of it was still in packages from the grocery store, and some of it was wrapped in butcher paper. Likely game picked up from Chester's hunting exploits. But on the top of one of the freezers was something else that seemed out of place. It was a red Solo cup full of frozen water with a penny sitting on top. I thought that was weird and dismissed it immediately, but curiosity got the better of me later that day when I got home. I decided to Google it, and what I learned instantly clicked as a way to get the ultimate revenge on Chester for hitting my car and sticking me with the repair bill. There's an old life hack that people used to use when they went on vacation. You freeze a cup of water, then place a penny on top of it and stick it in your freezer. If your power goes out, the water will eventually melt and the penny will fall to the bottom of the cup. If you return home and the penny is at the bottom of the cup, your freezer was off for an extended period of time. And now everything in it has potentially defrosted and become unfit for consumption. I immediately got up and ran back to Chester's garage to scope out the legitimacy of my nefarious deed. As luck would have it, Chester's circuit breaker was hidden behind a tool shelf, not directly visible to the naked eye. Who would put a shelf in front of a circuit breaker? Chester, of course. So I promptly took the cup out of the freezer and sat it on Chester's porch to let it get a little sun. After a few hours, the ice had melted enough that the penny slipped right to the bottom of the cup. I then put the cup back in the freezer, being very careful to position it exactly where it was when I took it out, before moving on to the last phase of my insidious plan. I started blowing up Chester's phone with calls and frantic text messages. "Chester, where is your circuit breaker? I can't find it, and your power is off. Get back to me ASAP." I did this countless times over the next 2 days before I finally got a call back from Chester. He told me immediately where to go in his garage to find the circuit breaker, which of course I already knew thanks to my prior detective work. I sat the phone down and flipped the circuit breaker twice, once to turn it off and then a second time to turn it back on, giving it just enough time to mess with the digital clocks on all his appliances. And with that, my revenge was complete. All that was left was for Chester to come back home, which took another 2 days. When Chester got back home, I was nervous but eager to see if my charade had worked. The next day, I got a knock on my door. It was Chester. He asked me if I wanted some meat to give to my dogs. Apparently, the power had been off for too long, and all the meat in his freezers had thawed out while he was gone. So he was throwing it out. I asked him how much he had, and he said it was probably somewhere close to 300 pounds. He didn't want to waste it all, so he asked if I wanted to give some to my dogs. I graciously helped myself to roughly half of a freezer's worth of meat, some of which I stored in my own fridge, and the rest Chester was nice enough to offer to hold on to in his freezer until I needed it. The kicker is that Chester had no idea the meat never actually defrosted and was still perfectly good. That night, I helped myself and my dogs to a couple of nice steaks, courtesy of old Chester himself, who was still busy walking the neighborhood unloading the tainted meat on anyone who had a cat or dog that might want it. It was at least 4 or 5 months before me and my dogs went through all the meat Chester had given us. I don't know if I made all my money back for the repairs on my car, but I didn't have to buy any meat for many a fortnight. I do feel bad about that in hindsight. Fortunately, I don't think hardly any of it got wasted. One of our neighbors has 4 giant pit bulls, so the free meat was a welcome offering. Not gonna lie, I still feel like a jerk though. In the comments, Original Fluff said, "Genius to not actually spoil the meat. Odd this guy would hit your car and say nothing, but still trust you." Comics replied, "He probably wasn't thinking and maybe thought the guy totally bought his teenager's excuse." Training Error added, "I know this one. The habitual liar will do something like that as sort of a gesture. Hey, look, I'm trusting you. You can trust me too, see?" OP is a vehicle for karma and he crashed right into Chester's meat stash. Ooh, that was bad. I think the real brilliance here is how little effort OP had to put into exacting his karmic revenge, and he benefited from the whole charade. Definitely next level. Will say though, I'm surprised Chester, being a prepper and all, doesn't have his home surrounded with cameras. OP might want to watch his back. Hopefully he's already parking elsewhere. Our third story brings us back to the pettier side of revenge, with a man whose neighbor decides a shared property line is nothing more than a convenient dumping ground. That is, until our hero decides to fan the flames of revenge in Story 3. Neighbor has long history of petty things, so I rotate a few fans 90 degrees. I used to live on the edge of a farm, and people used to rent my space out. This is important. My neighbor Bob is a nice enough guy to your face. Self-proclaimed morally upstanding religious man. Occasional petition to make some changes to state government to his worldview, and all around chatty when I have the infrequent pleasure to bump into him. Except he's a dingus and does petty stuff all the time I don't think he's aware that I know he does. While some are aggravating, most are perplexing and barely illegal and wouldn't be worth my effort to get the law involved. These are his stories. Insert Law and Order gavel. Once spent all day Saturday loading leaves onto a flatbed trailer. Now, Bob has a lot of property. Where does he put the leaves? He pulls out of his driveway, just gets past the corner of my front yard. Note, I have more property where the grass ends, and hits the gas. Leaves blow off to both sides of road. He turns around at the corner and pulls back into his driveway. Once had an apprentice surveyor come and practice surveying skills to mark the line. Said because he wasn't official, it wasn't. But it was 99% correct on it. Bob goes out one day and moves the markers off his driveway. I took pictures of the locations and made a note. Planted popple trees, fast growing, just on my side of the line fence, so they'd provide coverage for his pine trees to grow. I was annoyed, but figured if they gave me quicker coverage from him, I'd just deal with it. They have since gotten huge and some are dying off. I saw Bob outside once and asked him about the limbs falling, and he said they were on my side, so not much he can do. Every time I picked up limbs, I'd just toss back to his yard and they'd eventually disappear to his burn pile. Would you guess? Is sitting at the corner of our property together. Bob had a delivery of a huge piece of equipment. Because his driveway is small and not really usable for the long bed delivery truck, he told the delivery guy to just park and unload in my wide driveway. It made big ruts because of the weight of the machinery. To the delivery driver's credit, he didn't know any better. He said the neighbor said it was fine he used my driveway. Would get block permits to kill deer on his property, then dump the corpses deep in the woods just this side of my property. He knows where the line is. One time I heard a bunch of noise early one morning. Bob's 12-year-old son at the time has a tractor with a piece of equipment backed up to my garbage pile by the road. Trash coming in a few hours. And there's a bag hanging off the edge of the equipment. Son is jamming the raised lower lever to try and shake the bag loose. I called out and asked what he was doing and went out to see. Bob's son froze, and I asked him what was it. He wouldn't say. I opened the bag to find a deer head with maggots on it. Bob didn't want this in his trash, and it's illegal, so decided to just put it in mine. I told Bob Jr. to tell his dad if he did this again, he'd find it in his swimming pool and made his son take it back home. Bob never said anything about it. This is all I can think of at the top of my head, but I think you get his quasi-innocent, if not extremely annoying things he does. Petty, some would say. So fast forward 20-something years of this, and I strike a deal to let Farmer John put up some grain bins at my house, which happened to be the farthest point from my house and next to Bob's property at the corner where his house is at. These have huge fans. When they're doing this constructing, John mentions they would rather point them west, towards Bob's house, and not north. It would be more convenient to them as the fans protrude out a bit from the bins. but didn't want to sour my relationship with Bob. I assure him Bob and I have a special relationship, and I insist he points them to the west, because Bob wouldn't care. Fast forward months, and John actually uses grain bins, which he typically runs the fans at night when it's cool. The first morning after Bob knocks on my door and says he heard the fans last night and said he didn't realize they would be pointing towards his property, his house, and where his bedroom face, I said I didn't really think about it and just told them to put them where it would work best for them. Bob asked if they could be moved, and I said not without a crane rental, a team of men, and several days' worth of labor. I offered to get him a quote. Bob just mumbled, "That's okay," and left. Every time the fans ran after that, it was the peaceful, gentle white noise in the distance to lull me right to sleep. Bonus. When Bob saw all the dirt and construction going on and asked what was being built, I said Farmer John was putting up a 1,000 head pig shed. He just said, "Oh, okay." The next day, my township supervisor called to ask me about zoning issues and said he had a permit for bins, not a shed. In the comments, Bakatari said, "This is beautiful. Now you get to fan the flames of pettiness." Red Rose Belmont said, "He would kill the deer and not eat the meat? What a jerk." OP replied, "Yes, and I'm pretty sure in most cases you're supposed to use it for meat whenever possible. For him to donate it and or find a home for it all would have required actual Christian work, not the fake kind he pretended to preach." Bonus. He got fired as a principal of a local high school for forcing kids to have Bible sessions as detention. The old Sneaky Pete said, "Moving a bin fan is actually fairly easy. I'm going to guess Farmer John could probably do it in a day. It's essentially just moving one sheet of bin and swapping it with the other and then remounting the fan." OP replied, "This guy knows what's going on. You're essentially right. Bin, jacks, raise, unbolt, turn, lower, rebolt. In actuality, it could be done quicker and a lot cheaper than I foreshadowed to him. But he doesn't need to know that." Nobody likes a hypocrite. Fact. And OP's patience in delivering his revenge is both epic and virtuous. He'll be listening to that lull of white noise for years to come, basking in the glory of the retribution he delivered. Meanwhile, Bob will be complaining to the city about noise violations that will likely fall on deaf ears, since Farmer John followed the municipal bylaws and got the right permits. And it can't be ignored that OP did a bang-up job of enforcing his own brand of law and order. And that's it for today. Until next time, shine bright, Starlight. Yahoo! If you've enjoyed the story and would like to hear more, consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Thanks, and bye for now.